There is perhaps no more disagreeable sound in the civilized world than that of a clock striking 13, unless it be the sound of a clock striking 13 at 11:30 on a Tuesday morning when one has been summoned to investigate what the local gentry insist upon calling supernatural manifestations. Lord Peter Wimsey, having motored down from London through a particularly vindictive October drizzle, stood in the entrance hall of Greyminster Hall and listened to the offending timepiece complete its arithmetical rebellion with the sort of pained expression usually reserved for watching amateur theatricals. 13 strikes, he observed to his manservant, who was efficiently divesting himself of a rain-soaked driving coat, suggests either a profound misunderstanding of the decimal system or a clock with delusions of grandeur. In my experience, Bunter, mechanical devices that exceed their proper limitations are invariably symptomatic of human interference rather than supernatural intervention. "Quite so, my lord," replied Bunter with that particular tone of agreement that managed to convey both absolute loyalty and mild skepticism regarding his employer's tendency to pontificate upon temporal mechanics before breakfast. The summons had arrived 3 days prior in the form of a somewhat hysterical letter from Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, the widowed mistress of Greyminster Hall, who wrote in the trembling script of one unaccustomed to addressing peers of the realm but driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond her comprehension. The ancient bracket clock in the hall attic, she explained, had begun striking at irregular intervals with no regard for the actual time, disturbing the household sleep and causing the servants to cross themselves with alarming frequency. More disturbing still, the clock had not been wound in over a decade, having been relegated to the attic after the death of her late husband's eccentric brother, who had maintained an unhealthy fascination with horology and what the family diplomatically termed antiquarian pursuits. "Mrs. Ashworth to see you, my lord," announced the butler, a dignified gentleman of perhaps 60 years, whose bearing suggested long service in houses where eccentricity was considered a family trait rather than a personal failing. "She awaits you in the morning room, along with young Master Timothy and Miss Ashworth." Wimsey adjusted his monocle with the deliberate precision of one preparing for social combat. "Excellent, Bunter. And perhaps you might inquire of the domestic staff regarding the precise nature of these temporal disturbances. In my experience, servants possess an admirable facility for observing the sort of details that their betters prefer to overlook." The morning room of Greyminster Hall possessed that particular atmosphere of genteel decay that characterizes English country houses whose owners possess more ancestry than income. The furniture, while undoubtedly genuine Georgian, bore the subtle signs of careful maintenance rather than casual replacement. The Turkish carpet showed the sort of strategic fading that speaks of windows left uncurtained to spare the expense of proper drapery. Mrs. Ashworth herself proved to be a woman of perhaps 50 years, possessed of the sort of nervous energy that suggests a mind perpetually occupied with domestic crises and financial calculations. "Lord Peter," she began, rising from her chair with a sort of flutter that indicated genuine distress rather than social affectation, "how very good of you to come. I do hope you will forgive the presumption, but your reputation in matters of unusual circumstances has reached even our remote corner of Gloucestershire." Beside her stood a young man of perhaps 25, whose bearing suggested the sort of restless intelligence that finds country life insufficiently stimulating, and a young woman whose pale complexion and nervous manner indicated either ill health or the sort of sensitive temperament that finds mysterious clock striking deeply unsettling. "My son Timothy," Mrs. Ashworth continued, "and my daughter Evelyn, they have both been witnesses to these manifestations." "Manifestations," repeated Wimsey with the sort of delicate emphasis that managed to convey both interest and skepticism. "A curious choice of terminology, Mrs. Ashworth. Might one inquire whether these manifestations conform to any particular pattern, or do they represent a more democratic approach to temporal announcement?" Timothy Ashworth stepped forward with the confidence of one accustomed to speaking for his family. "The clock strikes at precisely 17 minutes past each hour, my lord, regardless of the actual time. It began exactly 1 week ago, on the anniversary of my great-uncle Mortimer's death. The servants are convinced it's his spirit, attempting to communicate some urgent message from beyond the grave." "Ah," said Wimsey, settling into his chair with the air of one who has encountered similar domestic crises. "Uncle Mortimer, I presume, was the gentleman with the horological enthusiasms. One finds that deceased relatives with specialized interests often become the subject of posthumous attribution when household machinery begins to misbehave. Tell me, was your great-uncle's interest in clocks purely academic, or did he possess the sort of practical knowledge that might have enabled him to adjust the mechanism in some unconventional manner?" Mrs. Ashworth exchanged a meaningful glance with her children before responding. "Uncle Mortimer was eccentric, my lord. He spent the last years of his life in the attic with his clocks and his books, claiming to be researching what he called temporal acoustics. The family physician attributed his obsession to the effects of a head injury sustained in India, but he was harmless enough. When he died, we simply locked away his collection rather than attempt to understand it." "And the key to this locked collection," Wimsey inquired with studied casualness, "remains in the family's possession?" "Naturally," replied Timothy, though his tone suggested the question had touched upon some delicate matter. "Though I should mention that the attic door was found unlocked yesterday morning, despite having been secured the previous evening. Mrs. Pemberton, our housekeeper, insists she heard footsteps overhead during the night, followed by what she describes as a most peculiar grinding sound, as if someone were adjusting the clock's mechanism." Wimsey's pale eyes brightened with the particular gleam that his acquaintances had learned to associate with intellectual stimulation and his enemies with impending exposure. He withdrew his monocle, polished it thoughtfully, and replaced it with the deliberate care of a surgeon preparing for a particularly delicate operation. "Grinding sounds," he murmured, "suggest mechanical adjustment rather than supernatural communication. Dead gentlemen, in my experience, rarely require tools for their manifestations. Mrs. Ashworth, I wonder if you would be so good as to conduct me to this temporal mystery. I find myself quite eager to make the acquaintance of Uncle Mortimer's rebellious timepiece." As they prepared to ascend to the attic, the hall clock struck the quarter hour with its usual mechanical precision, followed almost immediately by a distant, muffled chiming from somewhere high above their heads. The sound possessed an oddly hollow quality, as if it emanated from a space long sealed against the intrusion of the living world. 17 minutes passed, observed Evelyn Ashworth in a voice barely above a whisper. "Just as Timothy said, it never varies, never fails to strike at precisely that moment." "Consistency," remarked Wimsey as they began their ascent of the narrow servants' stair that led to the upper regions of the house, "is the hallmark of mechanical precision rather than spiritual intervention. Ghosts, I have observed, tend toward the dramatically unpredictable, while clockwork mechanisms, even when tampered with, maintain a stubborn adherence to their adjusted programming." The attic of Greyminster Hall stretched the full length of the house, a vast repository of 3 centuries' worth of accumulated possessions deemed too valuable to discard, yet too unfashionable to display. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light that filtered through grimy dormer windows, and the air carried the musty scent of old leather, forgotten textiles, and something else, a faint metallic odor that suggested the presence of well-oiled machinery. At the far end of the attic, partially concealed behind a collection of shrouded furniture, stood Uncle Mortimer's horological sanctuary. A massive oak table bore the evidence of his obsession: precision instruments, carefully labeled diagrams, and a collection of timepieces in various states of disassembly. But dominating the space, mounted upon the wall with an almost shrine-like reverence, hung the bracket clock that had summoned Lord Peter to Gloucestershire. It was a magnificent specimen of late 17th century craftsmanship, its ebonized case decorated with gilt bronze mounts and its brass dial gleaming despite the attic's perpetual twilight. The lunar calendar above the 12 showed a crescent moon with an oddly human expression, and the hands, Wimsey noted with professional interest, pointed to 23 minutes past 4, though his own pocket watch indicated 11:30. As they stood before this temporal anomaly, the clock began its rebellious announcement. The strikes came slowly, deliberately, each chime resonating through the confined space with an almost ceremonial gravity. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Then silence, profound and somehow expectant. Fascinating, murmured Wimsey, approaching the clock with the reverence of a connoisseur examining a particularly fine vintage. The mechanism appears to be in excellent condition, yet the hands remain frozen while the striking train continues to function. Such selective mechanical failure suggests either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate modification. He examined the clock's case with minute attention, noting the tiny scratches around the winding holes that indicated recent use, despite the family's assurance that the timepiece had remained untouched since Uncle Mortimer's death. More intriguing still, a thin layer of fresh oil gleamed on the exposed portions of the movement, and the brass showed the sort of careful polishing that spoke of regular maintenance. "Lord Peter," whispered Mrs. Ashworth, her voice tight with anxiety, "surely you don't believe that someone has been interfering with Uncle Mortimer's collection?" "My dear Mrs. Ashworth," replied Wimsey, his attention still focused upon the clock's mysterious mechanism, "I believe that someone has been doing considerably more than merely interfering. This timepiece has been recently wound, recently oiled, and, most significantly, recently adjusted to perform its current theatrical display. The question that presents itself is not whether human agency is involved, but rather what purpose this elaborate deception is intended to serve." He turned from the clock to survey the assembled family with that particular smile that had been known to make hardened criminals confess to crimes they had forgotten committing. "Tell me," he continued with deceptive casualness, "who among the household possesses the key to this attic sanctuary, and more importantly, who among your circle might possess sufficient knowledge of horological mechanisms to achieve such a precise modification?" The silence that followed his inquiry was broken only by the distant ticking of the hall clock below and the soft whisper of autumn wind against the dormer windows. But in that silence, Lord Peter detected the sort of tension that invariably precedes either revelation or violence, and he prepared himself for whichever eventuality the afternoon might provide. For in his considerable experience with the criminal mind, elaborate deceptions involving antique timepieces were rarely undertaken for purely sentimental reasons, and the striking of 17, that most irregular and attention-demanding number, suggested a signal rather than a supernatural manifestation. Someone at Greyminster Hall was using Uncle Mortimer's legacy to announce something far more earthly and considerably more dangerous than the mere passage of time. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire until Mrs. Ashworth drew breath with the sharp intake of one preparing for battle. "Lord Peter, surely you cannot suggest that someone in this household has been tampering with Uncle Mortimer's collection? We are a respectable family, and I'll not have such implications cast upon my children or my servants." "Implications, dear lady, are rather like morning mist," replied Wimsey with that particular smile that had been known to unnerve hardened criminals. "They tend to dissipate when exposed to the clear light of investigation. Bunter, if you would be so good as to examine the lock mechanism. I find that brass has an admirable tendency toward honesty in matters of recent interference." Bunter produced from his coat pocket a small leather case containing instruments that would have made a locksmith weep with professional envy. With the methodical precision of a surgeon, he dusted the keyhole with a fine graphite powder, revealing the telltale scratches and brass filings that spoke of recent amateur manipulation. "Fresh work, my lord," he observed, indicating the bright metal shavings that glinted in the dusty light. The wards show evidence of a key filed within the past week, and there are traces of soap used to ease an imperfect fit. Most illuminating. Soap, mused Wimsey, adjusting his monocle. The hallmark of the practical criminal rather than the supernatural entity. Ghosts, in my experience, rarely concerned themselves with lubrication. He turned his attention to Timothy, whose complexion had grown notably pale. You mentioned having occasion to borrow the attic key, Mr. Ashworth. Might one inquire about the nature of your visits to Uncle Mortimer's sanctuary? Timothy shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between his mother and sister before settling on his hands. I suppose I should mention that I developed something of an interest in mechanical devices during my time at Cambridge. Natural Sciences at Trinity under Professor Whitworth. Uncle Mortimer encouraged my studies, claiming the family needed someone who could properly maintain his collection after his death. Professor Whitworth, repeated Wimsey with evident satisfaction. A gentleman whose reputation for innovative mechanical solutions extends well beyond Cambridge. And did your curriculum include the modification of existing timepieces for experimental purposes? Naturally, Timothy replied, his voice carrying the defensive tone of one whose expertise has become inconveniently relevant. But I assure you, Lord Peter, any maintenance I've performed has been purely preservational. I would never dream of altering Uncle Mortimer's mechanisms. Mrs. Ashworth stepped forward with maternal protectiveness. Timothy has been most conscientious about preserving Uncle Mortimer's legacy. He spent countless hours cataloguing the collection and ensuring everything remains in proper order. How very commendable, murmured Wimsey, moving to examine a leather-bound notebook that lay open beside an array of precision tools. The pages were covered with detailed diagrams and calculations in a neat, scholarly hand. Temporal acoustics, he read aloud. Uncle Mortimer appears to have been quite the pioneer in this rather specialized field. These calculations seem to concern the resonant properties of striking mechanisms in confined spaces. Evelyn spoke for the first time since entering the attic, her voice barely audible. Uncle Mortimer believed that certain acoustic frequencies could affect the perception of time itself. He claimed that by adjusting the striking intervals of his clocks, he could create what he called temporal displacement zones. Fascinating, said Wimsey, though his tone suggested polite skepticism rather than genuine belief. And did he ever demonstrate these remarkable effects? He died before completing his experiments, she continued, her grey eyes meeting Wimsey's with a mixture of fear and desperate appeal. But the night before his death, he told Mrs. Pemberton that he had finally discovered the correct frequency, that he would soon prove his theories to the world. Wimsey's attention sharpened perceptibly. He turned to the notebook's final entries, noting that the last page contained a single line written in a trembling hand. The 17th hour approaches. Time will reveal all truths, no matter how carefully they have been buried. Below this, in different ink and steadier script, someone had added, "Some truths are better left buried, Uncle. Your experiments end tonight." "Most illuminating," he murmured, closing the notebook with careful precision. "Mrs. Ashworth, I believe it would be beneficial to speak with your domestic staff. Servants, in my experience, possess an admirable facility for observing details that their betters prefer to overlook." They descended to the morning room, where Wimsey conducted his interviews with the methodical thoroughness of a man accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, arrived with the rigid bearing of one whose authority had been questioned. "The attic key, my lord," she declared, her voice trembling with indignation, "was secured in my bureau drawer, locked tight as always. I placed it there myself after the quarterly airing, and I swear on my mother's grave it was there when I checked the following morning. Yet somehow it appeared on the hall console, bold as brass, for all to see." "The hall console?" repeated Wimsey. "Rather a public location for such an important key. And you noticed nothing unusual during the night of the first manifestation. Nothing but that dreadful grinding sound, my lord, like some great mechanical beast gnawing at the woodwork, and the clock striking 17 times at precisely 17 minutes past midnight. It fair made my blood run cold. Pritchard, the butler, corroborated her account with the precision of a man accustomed to accuracy. I myself secured the attic door that evening, my lord. Found it unlatched the next morning, not forced, mind you, simply open. And I distinctly recall seeing the key on the console late that same evening. Most irregular. As the interviews concluded, Wimsey withdrew to examine a small silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a thin, clever young man with an amused expression, a cigarette case glinting in his hand. "Mr. Crispin Fane," explained Timothy, following Wimsey's gaze. "A friend from Oxford. He visited last Wednesday, rides a motor bicycle, and has a tendency to appear unexpectedly." "And does Mr. Fane share your interest in mechanical devices?" inquired Wimsey with studied casualness. "He's brilliant at most things he attempts," replied Timothy, though his tone suggested this brilliance was not entirely appreciated. "Mother finds him rather challenging." "I find him disagreeable," said Mrs. Ashworth with characteristic directness. "He admires nothing but his own opinions and smokes those dreadful Turkish cigarettes with the camel on the packet." "Turkish cigarettes," mused Wimsey, noting the faint aromatic scent that still lingered in the attic air. "A taste that suggests either refinement or affectation, and in my experience, affectation is often more expensive and considerably more dangerous." He moved to the window, examining the fresh scratches around the dormer latch and the telltale smear of lanolin that Bunter had discovered. The view commanded the stable yard and the belt of yews beyond, a route that would allow clandestine access to someone familiar with the house's layout. "Bunter," he said quietly, "I believe we are dealing with someone who possesses both mechanical expertise and intimate knowledge of this household's routines. The 17-minute timing is not random. It serves as a signal, precisely timed to occur when the household is settling into evening routine." "Indeed, my lord," replied Bunter. "The acoustic properties Uncle Mortimer discovered have been turned to rather more practical purposes than temporal displacement." As if summoned by their discussion, the hall clock struck the half-hour, followed moments later by the muffled 17 chimes from above. But this time, Wimsey was positioned to observe, something that made his pale eyes narrow with sudden interest. For just an instant, as the 17th chime faded, he caught sight of a shadow moving past the dormer window, a shadow that suggested someone was not only familiar with the attic's secrets, but was actively monitoring their investigation. "Most illuminating," he murmured, withdrawing his pocket watch to note the precise time. "It appears our mysterious horologist is not content to remain a passive observer. The game, as they say, is afoot, and I suspect we shall discover that Uncle Mortimer's death was considerably less natural than the family physician determined." He turned to face the assembled Ashworths with that particular smile that his acquaintances had learned to associate with the imminent exposure of carefully concealed truths. For when a clock strikes 17 at such precise intervals, it is rarely the work of supernatural forces, but rather of a very much alive and decidedly calculating individual with secrets that demand both concealment and communication. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the morning room, and Lord Peter Wimsey prepared himself for an evening that promised to reveal whether the mysterious signals from Uncle Mortimer's attic were announcing the hour of revelation or counting down to something far more sinister than the mere passage of time. The decision to pursue the shadow immediately would have been inartistic. One does not spring upon a shy truth. One permits it to believe itself unobserved while quietly laying out the saucer of milk. Wimsey merely adjusted his monocle with deliberate precision and observed, in the tone one might use to decline a second helping of pudding, that if it would not inconvenience Mrs. Ashworth, he and Bunter should very much like to examine the attic once more before the light failed entirely. "Of course, Lord Peter," Mrs. Ashworth replied, though her voice carried the particular strain of a hostess whose domestic arrangements have been thoroughly disrupted by circumstances beyond her control. "Timothy, perhaps you would show Lord Peter the way." Timothy rose with the alacrity of a young man eager to demonstrate his usefulness, though Wimsey noted the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for the oil lamp. "Certainly, Mother, though I should mention that Crispin Fane is expected this evening. He sent word yesterday that he might call, something about examining Uncle Mortimer's collection for his own research." "Mr. Fane," repeated Wimsey with that particular inflection that managed to convey both interest and mild disapproval. "The gentleman with the mechanical inclinations and the Turkish cigarettes. How very convenient of him to manifest himself at precisely this juncture. One might almost suspect that mysterious clock signals possess a remarkable capacity for summoning interested parties from considerable distances." In the attic, the dying light cast long shadows across Uncle Mortimer's horological sanctuary. The bracket clock maintained its silent vigil, hands frozen at 23 minutes past 4, while the scent of well-oiled brass mingled with something else, a faint aromatic trace that spoke of expensive tobacco and recent human presence. Bunter, with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining a wound, dusted the dormer window's latch with fine graphite powder. The results were immediately illuminating. Fresh scratches around the mechanism, tiny brass filings that glinted in the lamplight, and most significantly, a thin smear of lanolin that had been applied to ease the passage of an imperfectly fitted key. "Recent work, my lord," Bunter observed, indicating the telltale evidence. "The wards show manipulation within the past week, and there are traces of soap used to facilitate entry. Most instructive." "Soap," mused Wimsey, examining a small fragment of cigarette ash that clung to the window frame. "The hallmark of the practical criminal rather than the supernatural entity. Ghosts, in my considerable experience, rarely concern themselves with lubrication." He withdrew a small magnifying glass and studied the ash with the reverence of a botanist examining a rare specimen. Turkish tobacco, with what appears to be an admixture of opium resin, a rather expensive affectation that suggests either refined taste or deliberate ostentation. The sound of gravel crunching beneath motor bicycle tires interrupted their investigation. Through the grimy dormer window, they observed a lean young man dismounting from a powerful machine with the casual arrogance of one accustomed to making dramatic entrances. He wore a leather coat that had seen considerable use and carried himself with a particular swagger that comes from excellent breeding combined with insufficient moral supervision. "Mr. Crispin Fane, I presume," murmured Wimsey, noting the way the newcomer's gaze swept the house's upper windows with professional assessment. "Observe, Bunter, how our mysterious horologist arrives at precisely the moment when his handiwork is under scrutiny. Coincidence, in my experience, is rarely so obliging." They descended to find the household in a state of barely controlled agitation. Fane had been shown into the morning room, where his presence seemed to fill the space with a particular tension that spoke of complicated relationships and unresolved conflicts. He was perhaps 28, with sharp, intelligent features that suggested both considerable charm and a capacity for ruthlessness when circumstances demanded it. "Lord Peter Wimsey," Fane said, rising with a bow that managed to be both perfectly correct and subtly mocking. "Your reputation in matters of criminal investigation precedes you, my lord. How fascinating to encounter you in such atmospheric circumstances." "Mr. Fane," replied Wimsey with equal courtesy and considerably more sincerity. "How thoughtful of you to concern yourself with the Ashworth family's domestic difficulties. One assumes your interest is purely altruistic." "Naturally," Fane responded, though his smile suggested anything but natural altruism. "Timothy and I have been friends since Oxford, and I've always maintained a scholarly interest in Uncle Mortimer's horological experiments. Such a tragedy that his work died with him." "Did it indeed?" Wimsey's pale eyes brightened with the particular gleam that his acquaintances had learned to associate with intellectual stimulation. I had rather formed the impression that his experiments were continuing under new management. The temporal acoustics in the attic suggest someone has been carrying on his research with considerable dedication and mechanical expertise. As if summoned by their discussion, the hall clock struck the quarter hour with its usual precision, followed moments later by the muffled 17 chimes from above. But this time, Wimsey was positioned to observe something that made his monocle catch the lamplight with sudden interest. For just an instant, as the 17th chime faded, Fane's right hand moved unconsciously toward his waistcoat pocket, the gesture of a man checking a timepiece against a predetermined schedule. "Most punctual," observed Wimsey as the final chime died away. "One might almost suspect that our mysterious horologist operates according to a carefully coordinated timetable, rather than responding to supernatural inspiration. Tell me, Mr. Fane, do you find the 17-minute interval significant from a horological perspective?" Fane's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. The sort of minute change that would have escaped notice from anyone less observant than a professional detective. 17 is certainly an unusual choice, Lord Peter. Most striking mechanisms prefer the conventional quarters or half hours, but Uncle Mortimer was rather fond of prime numbers, claiming they possessed certain acoustic properties that enhanced temporal perception. "Fascinating," murmured Wimsey, moving to examine Uncle Mortimer's notebook once more. "And did your Oxford curriculum include the modification of existing timepieces for experimental purposes?" "Naturally," Fane replied, his tone carrying the defensive note of one whose expertise has become inconveniently relevant. Professor Whitworth was quite advanced in his approach to mechanical innovation. But I assure you, Lord Peter, any maintenance I performed on Uncle Mortimer's collection has been purely preservational." Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway with the rigid bearing of one whose authority has been questioned by circumstances beyond her control. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but there's been another development. The attic key, the one I found on the hall console this morning, it's disappeared again. Clean vanished from my bureau drawer, though I locked it away not 2 hours past." "Indeed," said Wimsey, his attention sharpening perceptibly. "And when did you last observe this peripatetic key in its proper location?" "Just after tea, my lord. I checked it special-like, knowing you were investigating. But when I went to fetch it for the evening rounds, the drawer was empty as a church on Monday." Bunter materialized at Wimsey's elbow with the silent efficiency of a well-trained apparition. "My lord, if I might suggest a thorough examination of the stable yard and the approaches through the U-belt, the lanolin traces suggest our visitor has established multiple routes of access." "Excellent, Bunter. And perhaps you might also investigate whether any of the household's oil lamps have been recently requisitioned for nocturnal expeditions. Our mysterious horologist appears to favor the hours when honest folk are abed." As Bunter departed on his mission, the hall clock struck the half hour. 17 minutes later, the attic responded with its mechanical lament, but this time the sound carried a subtle difference. A faint grinding noise that preceded the chimes, as if someone were making final adjustments to the mechanism. "Most illuminating," Wimsey murmured, withdrawing his pocket watch to note the precise time. It appears our horological virtuoso is not content to remain a passive observer. The 17-minute interval serves as more than mere temporal announcement. It functions as a signal, carefully timed to coordinate with activities that require both precision and concealment. He turned to face the assembled company with that particular smile that had been known to make hardened criminals confess to crimes they had forgotten committing. For when a clock strikes 17 at such precise intervals, it is rarely the work of supernatural forces, but rather of a very much alive and decidedly calculating individual whose purposes extend considerably beyond mere mechanical experimentation. The afternoon light was fading rapidly, casting long shadows across the morning room, and Lord Peter Wimsey prepared himself for an evening that promised to reveal whether Uncle Mortimer's death had been the peaceful conclusion to an eccentric life or merely the opening gambit in a considerably more dangerous game of temporal deception and carefully orchestrated murder. The game, as they say, was most decidedly afoot, and the 17 chimes that echoed through Greyminster Hall were counting down not to revelation, but to a confrontation that would test whether human ingenuity could triumph over mechanical precision in the ancient art of concealing inconvenient truth. Dinner at Greyminster Hall proceeded with that particular atmosphere of strained civility that characterizes households where the specter of supernatural manifestation has been raised in polite conversation. Mrs. Ashworth presided over the modest repast with the determined cheerfulness of a hostess whose domestic arrangements have been thoroughly disrupted by circumstances beyond her comprehension, while the conversation maintained the careful neutrality of guests who suspect their fellow diners of harboring inconvenient secrets. Wimsey occupied himself with the sort of seemingly irrelevant observations that his acquaintances had learned to regard with profound unease. Between courses, he inquired with apparent casualness about the soundproofing qualities of the house's upper floors, the precise timing of the servants' evening routines, and the curious acoustic properties that might cause certain sounds to carry more distinctly at particular hours than at others. The architecture of Greyminster Hall, he observed, delicately dissecting his portion of mutton, possesses that admirable quality of solid construction that our ancestors favored when they built for permanence rather than convenience. Tell me, Mrs. Ashworth, do the servants' quarters lie directly beneath the attic? And what of the general acoustic properties? Does this venerable edifice possess any particular tendencies toward the transmission of unexpected noises? Timothy, eager to demonstrate his scholarly knowledge, leaned forward with enthusiasm. The east wing, where the staff rooms are located, does indeed lie beneath a portion of the attic, Lord Peter, and the old lead pipes do produce rather alarming groans, particularly when the hot water is drawn in the mornings. As for the house itself, it creaks like an elderly gentleman with rheumatism, especially during windy weather. Most illuminating, murmured Wimsey, noting that Crispin Fane's hand moved unconsciously toward his waistcoat pocket as Timothy spoke. And the household's evening routine, I presume, follows a schedule of military precision. At what hour do the various members of the domestic staff typically retire? Mrs. Pemberton, who had entered to clear the soup course, responded with the rigid efficiency of one whose authority depends upon maintaining proper schedules. Pritchard and I are usually abed by 10 o'clock sharp, my lord. The junior staff retire by past, and the family generally follows by 11. By midnight, the house settles into proper quiet, save for the wind in the chimneys and the occasional settling of old timbers. Midnight, repeated Wimsey, making a mental note of the timing, and the attic clock began its curious performance at precisely 17 minutes past that hour, a week ago tonight. Rather specific timing for a spontaneous supernatural manifestation. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Fane? Fane's response was accompanied by that particular smile that manages to convey both amusement and subtle condescension. Perhaps Uncle Mortimer's spirit operates according to a more precise schedule than most, Lord Peter. He was always rather obsessive about temporal accuracy during his lifetime. As if summoned by their discussion, the hall clock struck the quarter hour with its usual mechanical precision, followed moments later by the muffled 17 chimes from above. But this time, Wimsey detected a subtle difference in the sound, a faint grinding noise that preceded the strikes, as if someone were making final adjustments to the mechanism even as it performed its mysterious function. Fascinating, he murmured, withdrawing his pocket watch to note the precise timing. The mechanical protest that precedes each performance suggests ongoing manipulation rather than a fixed modification. Bunter, I believe our evening's entertainment may prove more illuminating than anticipated. Following dinner, Wimsey conducted what he termed a domestic reconnaissance with the methodical thoroughness that had made him legendary among London's criminal classes. Under the guise of admiring the house's architectural features, he examined the narrow servants' stair that provided the most discreet access to the upper regions, noting the fresh scratches around the attic door's lock mechanism and the telltale smear of soap that indicated recent amateur manipulation. Bunter, meanwhile, had been conducting his own investigation with characteristic efficiency. He materialized at Wimsey's elbow as they examined the dormer window that commanded a view of the stable yard, producing from his coat pocket a collection of items that would have made a Scotland Yard detective weep with professional envy. "Most instructive findings, my lord," he reported in his customary undertone. "2 oil lamps missing from the servants' cupboard, though one has been returned during the dinner hour, with fresh soot upon the chimney and traces of beeswax about the collar. In the stable yard, tire marks of a motor bicycle, tread consistent with a Dunlop cord, presumably Mr. Fane's machine. Also, footprints beneath the attic dormer, suggesting the recent use of a ladder, which I discovered in the potting shed with fresh lanolin upon the uprights." "Lanolin," mused Wimsey, examining the dormer window's latch with his magnifying glass. "The hallmark of the practical criminal rather than the supernatural entity. Ghosts, in my considerable experience, rarely concern themselves with the lubrication of temporal mechanisms." He indicated the tiny scratches around the window's catch and the thin smear of the same substance that had eased its operation. "Someone has been using this window for clandestine access, and recently enough that the evidence remains fresh." The investigation of Uncle Mortimer's horological sanctuary revealed modifications that would have horrified the original clockmaker and delighted a mechanically minded criminal. The bracket clock's movement had been fitted with a crude but ingenious adjunct, a small cam on a separate arbor, rigged to interfere with the striking train's normal operation. The additions were recent. The screw heads bore the distinctive burr of tools, slightly missized for the task, and a fine string of black horsehair had been run under the bell hammer, extending through a minute hole freshly bored near the dormer-facing panel. "External. Control for the hammer," observed Wimsey, tugging gently on the horsehair. Somewhere outside, something responded with a faint tick. A method of muting the strikes when stealth is required, or perhaps of signaling without sound when the house is occupied. Combined with the beeswax smearing on the window pane, one has the elements of a rather sophisticated communication system. As they prepared to descend, the hall clock struck 9, followed by the now familiar 17 chimes from above. But this time, the sequence was augmented by something new, a series of shorter strikes that seemed to spell out a deliberate pattern. 7 strikes, then 3, then 7 again, followed by a pause and a longer sequence that suggested urgent communication rather than mere temporal announcement. 737, murmured Wimsey, noting the pattern in his notebook. Rather suggestive of a predetermined code than a supernatural communication. The 17-minute interval serves not merely as a temporal marker, but as a signal to coordinate activities that require both precision and concealment. Through the grimy dormer window, they observed a light moving in the stable yard. Not the steady glow of a servant's lamp, but the focused beam of an electric torch manipulated by someone familiar with clandestine nighttime activities. The light flashed once, twice, then disappeared behind the belt of yews that screened the property from the lane beyond. "Most illuminating," said Wimsey, adjusting his monocle with deliberate precision. "It appears our horological virtuoso is preparing for the evening's performance. The question that presents itself is whether these elaborate temporal theatrics are intended to honor Uncle Mortimer's memory or to conceal the circumstances that necessitated his rather convenient departure from this mortal coil." As they made their way back through the sleeping house, the implications of their discoveries began to form a pattern as precise and methodical as the clockwork mechanism that had been so cleverly subverted. Someone at Greyminster Hall possessed both the mechanical expertise to modify antique timepieces and the intimate knowledge of the household's routines necessary to coordinate a complex deception. The 17 chimes that echoed through the ancient corridors were counting down not to supernatural revelation, but to a confrontation that would test whether human ingenuity could triumph over mechanical precision in the ancient art of concealing inconvenient truths. The game, as Lord Peter was fond of observing, was most decidedly afoot, and the mysterious signals from Uncle Mortimer's attic were announcing not the hour of spiritual communication, but the precise timing of something far more earthly and considerably more dangerous than the mere passage of time. The evening settled upon Greyminster Hall with the deliberate precision of a well-rehearsed theatrical performance, each member of the household retiring according to their customary schedule, while maintaining the sort of heightened awareness that suggests minds occupied with matters considerably more pressing than sleep. Wimsey, ostensibly absorbed in a volume of Horace borrowed from the library, observed this domestic choreography with the attention of a naturalist studying the habits of potentially dangerous specimens. Mrs. Pemberton completed her final rounds with military punctuality, though her inspection of the hall console was rather more thorough than mere routine would suggest. Pritchard followed his customary circuit, pausing at each window and door with the methodical care of one whose authority depends upon maintaining proper security. By 10:30, the servants' quarters had fallen silent, leaving only the family and their guest to maintain the increasingly strained pretense of normal evening conversation. "A delightfully atmospheric old pile," observed Fane, settling into his chair with the casual arrogance of one who considers himself master of any situation. "These ancient houses possess such character, don't you find, Lord Peter? Every creak and groan tells a story of centuries past." "Indeed," replied Wimsey, not looking up from his classical text, "though I find that the most interesting stories are usually told by the creaks and groans that occur at precisely timed intervals, rather than those that follow the random patterns of settling timber. The human element, you see, tends toward regularity, while nature prefers the delightfully unpredictable." Timothy excused himself shortly before 11, though his departure was preceded by a meaningful glance toward Fane that did not escape Wimsey's attention. Mrs. Ashworth followed within minutes, pausing to ensure that the French windows were securely latched with the sort of maternal vigilance that suggested recent cause for concern about nocturnal security. As the hall clock struck 11, followed by the now familiar 17 chimes from above, Wimsey noted that this evening's sequence carried subtle variations, longer pauses, additional strikes that spelled out what could only be described as deliberate communication. The pattern was unmistakably intentional. 7 strikes, pause, 3 strikes, pause, 7 again, followed by a more complex sequence that suggested urgent coordination rather than mere temporal announcement. 7, 3, 7, murmured Wimsey, making a mental note. Rather suggestive of a predetermined cipher than supernatural manifestation. "Tell me, Mr. Fane, does that particular numerical sequence hold significance in the realm of mechanical experimentation?" Before Fane could respond, the distant rumble of a motor engine approached along the lane beyond the U-belt, stopping abruptly as if the driver had chosen stealth over convenience. Through the morning-room window, Wimsey glimpsed a shadowy figure crossing the stable yard, with the confident stride of one familiar with the terrain. "Rather late for social calls," he observed, with studied casualness, "though I suspect our nocturnal visitor possesses sufficient familiarity with the local geography to navigate without assistance." Fane had risen with the sudden alertness of a cat detecting approaching prey, his hand moving unconsciously toward his waistcoat pocket, in the gesture of a man checking a timepiece against a predetermined schedule. "Perhaps I should investigate," he offered, though his tone suggested the offer was purely ceremonial. "How thoughtful," replied Wimsey, his pale eyes taking on that particular gleam his acquaintances had learned to associate with imminent revelation. "Bunter, I believe the evening's entertainment is about to commence." It was agreed, therefore, with the delicate unanimity that develops among conspirators, that they should observe rather than interfere with whatever theatrical performance was about to unfold. Wimsey positioned himself where he could command a view of both the attic dormer and the stable-yard approaches, while Bunter, with characteristic efficiency, had already prepared the sort of equipment that would make their surveillance both comprehensive and undetectable. At precisely 17 minutes past midnight, as the hall clock declared the hour with Protestant rectitude, the attic responded with its calculated heresy. But this time, Wimsey was positioned to observe the mechanical ballet that accompanied the striking. A narrow beam of light appeared at the dormer window, followed by the careful insertion of what appeared to be a thin metal tool. The window opened with the practiced silence of one accustomed to clandestine entry. The figure that emerged through the dormer possessed the sort of lean agility that spoke of considerable experience in nocturnal activities. Hooded lamp masked to produce only the thinnest beam, the intruder moved directly to Uncle Mortimer's bracket clock with the confidence of one following a well-rehearsed plan. But as Wimsey observed the careful manipulation of the clock's mechanism, it became apparent that while the visitor understood the striking modifications, the location of Uncle Mortimer's hidden compartment remained a mystery requiring systematic exploration. The discovery of the concealed panel, cleverly disguised within the wainscoting beside the clock, revealed a cavity containing what appeared to be a flat packet bound with waxed twine. The intruder's gloved thumb pressed at the binding with the expectation of one accustomed to such clandestine retrievals. "Try the other knot," observed Wimsey amiably from the darkness. The response was immediate and professionally competent, a rush toward the dormer that spoke of considerable experience in rapid retreat. The packet, jolted free during the struggle, skated across the dusty floorboards, leaving a neat diagonal scar where the twine cut through Bunter's carefully applied French chalk. The intruder's escape was accomplished with admirable efficiency, though the potting shed ladder, which Bunter had thoughtfully modified with a modest inconvenience to the second rung, expressed sudden protest in the darkness below. Bunter's subsequent examination of the recovered evidence proved illuminating. The packet, docketed in Uncle Mortimer's elegant script as "to be placed with the Ashworth Trust, not to be opened without express instruction," contained a collection of documents that revealed the true nature of the deceased gentleman's temporal acoustics research. Among the papers were receipts, transfers, and memoranda concerning what could only be described as a sophisticated lending operation, with Uncle Mortimer accepting personal secrets as collateral against financial advances. Most significantly, a note in Mortimer's decisive hand read, "Deferred payment to be redeemed upon presentation of the bell note. Number 17. Below this, in different ink and a more modern script, settled with E.A., no further letters, keep Fane at arm's length. The entry had been struck through and beneath the cancellation in yet another hand. Fane insists on examination, says Whitworth will back him. Dangerous. The morning brought additional revelations in the form of a telegram from Cambridge, delivered by Bunter with the discretion of a valet and the satisfaction of a successful intelligence agent. Whitworth, presently at Zurich stop, has not seen. Fane 2 years. Stop states. Fane dismissed after questionable experiments with student mechanism. Stop advises. Caution. Stop Harrison, secretary. Questionable experiments, observed Wimsey cheerfully over breakfast. How delightfully euphemistic the academic vocabulary becomes when confronted with behavior that would be considered criminal in less scholarly circles. The confrontation with Evelyn Ashworth, who appeared in the library doorway pale and rigid with the sort of desperation that comes from watching carefully constructed deceptions begin to unravel, provided the final piece of the psychological puzzle. Her confession, delivered in whispers that sank rather than rose with emotion, revealed the true nature of Uncle Mortimer's hold over the household and the desperate measures that certain individuals had undertaken to prevent the exposure of youthful indiscretions. "He said there were letters," she whispered, her hands gripping the door frame as if the solid brass were the only reliable thing in her collapsing world. "Stupid, romantic things I wrote when I was 19. He told me Uncle Mortimer kept everything locked away, and that if we did not find them first, Timothy, Mother, everyone, would be ruined." But as Wimsey gently probed her testimony, it became apparent that Miss Ashworth had never actually seen such correspondence among her uncle's papers. What she had discovered instead was evidence of a far more systematic operation. Uncle Mortimer's practice of accepting numbered silver bells as tokens from those who sought his financial assistance, with the understanding that failure to repay would result in the public revelation of whatever secrets had been offered as collateral. He was not wicked, she insisted with touching loyalty. Only lonely. He liked his clocks better than people. When people failed him, he made rules. It was safer. The 17 chimes that continued to echo through Greyminster Hall at their precisely calculated intervals were no longer mysterious temporal manifestations, but the mechanical heartbeat of a blackmail operation that had survived its creator's death. Someone had been using Uncle Mortimer's ingenious signaling system to coordinate the retrieval of compromising documents, and the recent modifications to the striking mechanism suggested that the operation was entering a new and considerably more dangerous phase. The game, as Lord Peter was fond of observing, had reached that delicate juncture where desperation meets opportunity, and the ancient bracket clock that had once served Uncle Mortimer's peculiar blend of scientific curiosity and financial opportunism was now counting down to a confrontation that would determine whether the secrets buried in Greyminster Hall's attic would remain safely entombed or emerge to destroy the carefully maintained facade of rural respectability that the Ashworth family had struggled so desperately to preserve. The silver bell rested upon the morning-room table with the particular malevolence that inanimate objects acquire when they become evidence of human wickedness. Wimsey regarded it with the detached interest of a naturalist examining a particularly venomous specimen, while the assembled company maintained that peculiar silence that precedes either revelation or violence. The difficulty with inherited criminal enterprises, observed Wimsey, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of one whose theories were achieving elegant confirmation, lies in the transition of management. Uncle Mortimer possessed both the personal authority and the mechanical expertise to maintain his peculiar system of financial accommodation. His successor, however, required considerably more theatrical assistance to achieve the same effect. He withdrew from his waistcoat pocket Uncle Mortimer's leather-bound notebook, opening it to a page marked with a silk ribbon. Bunter's examination of the deceased gentleman's records reveals a system of remarkable sophistication. Each numbered bell corresponded to a specific obligation, with detailed documentation of the collateral provided. Letters, photographs, legal documents, and in some cases, merely the borrower's signed confession of indiscretions that would prove socially devastating if revealed. Mrs. Ashworth leaned forward with the desperate intensity of one whose domestic security depended upon understanding the full extent of the threat to her family's reputation. But surely, Lord Peter, Uncle Mortimer's death would have ended such arrangements. The grave, as they say, keeps its secrets. "Ah, but graves are notoriously poor at maintaining filing systems," replied Wimsey with that particular smile that had been known to unnerve hardened criminals. The secrets remained, carefully catalogued and cross-referenced, requiring only someone with sufficient mechanical knowledge to reactivate the communication system Uncle Mortimer had so ingeniously devised. Bunter materialized at Wimsey's elbow with his customary efficiency, producing from his coat pocket a collection of items that would have made a Scotland Yard detective weep with professional envy. The evidence recovered from the attic workshop, my lord. Fresh tool marks on the bracket clock's movement, traces of soap and lanolene on the window mechanism, and most significantly, this. He placed upon the table a small brass key, its surface bearing the distinctive scratches of recent filing, discovered in the potting shed, along with the modified ladder. The key has been altered to fit Uncle Mortimer's desk locks, though it was originally intended for a different purpose entirely. "Most illuminating," murmured Wimsey, examining the key with his magnifying glass. "The filing marks are fresh, within the past week, I should estimate, and the technique speaks of someone with mechanical training but insufficient patience for precision work. A gentleman accustomed to having his tools properly maintained by others, perhaps." Timothy, who had been following this reconstruction with growing unease, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Crispin has always been clever with mechanical devices, Lord Peter. At Cambridge, he could repair anything from bicycle chains to laboratory equipment. But surely you cannot suggest that he would—" "I suggest nothing beyond what the evidence demonstrates," Wimsey interrupted gently. "Mr. Fane possesses the requisite knowledge to modify Uncle Mortimer's striking mechanism. He has been observed in clandestine communication with accomplices using the 17-minute signal system, and he was discovered tonight in possession of silver bell number 17 despite Miss Evelyn's supposed settlement of her obligations. These facts, taken collectively, suggest a pattern of behavior extending considerably beyond scholarly curiosity." The chronology of Uncle Mortimer's final evening began to emerge through careful reconstruction of witness testimony and physical evidence. Mrs. Pemberton's household records confirmed that all doors and windows had been secured by 10:30, yet the attic door was found unlatched the following morning. Pritchard's testimony established that the study telephone line had indeed failed during the evening's river mist, yet a call had been placed to Dr. Halliday at precisely 12:42 from the vicarage, according to Miss Webb's meticulous exchange records. "The timing is crucial," Wimsey explained, consulting his pocket watch with the precision of a railway conductor. 7 minutes through the U-belt to reach the vicarage, allowing our mysterious caller to depart Greyminster Hall at 12:35 and return by 12:50. A narrow window, but sufficient for someone familiar with the terrain and possessed of urgent motivation. As if summoned by their discussion, the hall clock struck the quarter hour, followed moments later by the muffled 17 chimes from above. But this time, Wimsey was positioned to observe something that made his monocle catch the lamplight with sudden interest. "Observe, if you will, the precise timing," he said, withdrawing his notebook to record the interval. 17 minutes past each hour, without variation. Such mechanical precision suggests not supernatural manifestation, but rather a carefully adjusted striking mechanism operated according to a predetermined schedule. The investigation of Uncle Mortimer's workshop revealed modifications that would have horrified the original clockmaker and delighted a mechanically minded criminal. The bracket clock's movement bore fresh tool marks where someone had installed a crude but ingenious modification, a secondary cam designed to interfere with the striking train's normal operation at precisely calculated intervals. "External control," observed Wimsey, indicating the thin horsehair line that extended from the mechanism through a minute hole in the case. "A method of muting or enhancing the strikes as circumstances required. Combined with the beeswax shuttering system Bunter discovered on the silver salver, one has the elements of a sophisticated communication network." Fane, who had been following this mechanical exposition with the alert attention of one whose professional reputation depended upon understanding the full extent of his exposure, finally spoke. "Lord Peter, I believe you are constructing an elaborate theory upon rather circumstantial evidence. My interest in Uncle Mortimer's collection has always been purely academic." "Academic interest?" repeated Wimsey thoughtfully. "Rarely requires the sort of clandestine nocturnal activities we observed this evening. Nor does it typically involve the systematic modification of antique timepieces to coordinate with accomplices lurking in U-belts." He turned to face Evelyn, whose pale complexion and nervous manner suggested the weight of secrets too long carried. "Miss Ashworth, I believe it is time to clarify the precise nature of your relationship with Mr. Fane's research. The letters he claimed to be protecting, Did you ever actually observe such correspondence among Uncle Mortimer's papers? The confession, when it came, possessed that quality of inevitable collapse that characterizes moments when elaborate deceptions finally succumb to accumulated pressure. Evelyn had never seen any compromising letters bearing her name. What Fane had shown her instead were Uncle Mortimer's detailed records of the blackmail operation, with particular emphasis on the devastating consequences that would follow if certain information became public knowledge. "He said he was protecting the family," she whispered, her hands gripping the chair arms with desperate intensity. That Uncle Mortimer had collected secrets from half the county, and that without proper management everything would be exposed. He only needed access to retrieve the most dangerous documents. "And in exchange for this protection," Wimsey continued gently, "you provided him with information about the household routines, the location of keys, and, most importantly, assistance in maintaining the fiction that Uncle Mortimer's death had been entirely natural." The final piece of the puzzle emerged through Bunter's methodical examination of the physical evidence. The lamp found in Uncle Mortimer's workshop bore traces of having been raised too quickly, smoking the chimney in a manner consistent with sudden haste rather than careful adjustment. More significantly, the positioning of the body suggested not a simple fall, but rather a struggle that had ended with the elderly gentleman's head striking the corner of his workbench. The 17 chimes that began that very night, Wimsey explained, were not supernatural manifestations, but rather Mr. Fane's method of signaling to accomplices that the transition of authority had been successfully accomplished. Uncle Mortimer's blackmail operation would continue under new management, with considerably more aggressive collection methods. As the implications of this reconstruction settled upon the morning room, the ancient bracket clock struck its rebellious sequence once more. But now the sound carried a different significance entirely, not the ghostly lament of a disturbed spirit, but the mechanical heartbeat of a criminal enterprise that had required murder to achieve its full potential. The game, as Lord Peter was fond of observing, had reached that crucial juncture where human desperation meets mechanical precision, and the 17 chimes that echoed through Greyminster Hall were counting down not to supernatural revelation, but to a confrontation that would determine whether the carefully constructed facade of academic respectability could survive the methodical exposure of systematic blackmail, calculated murder, and the sort of family secrets that certain individuals would kill to protect. For when antique timepieces are modified to serve as instruments of extortion, and when silver bells become tokens in elaborate games of human weakness, the machinery of justice begins to operate with the same inexorable precision that had once served Uncle Mortimer's peculiar blend of scientific curiosity and financial opportunism, and had ultimately led to his carefully orchestrated demise at the hands of someone who understood that dead men tell no tales, but their clocks might continue to strike the hour of judgment for all who had participated in transforming a gentleman's eccentric hobby into an instrument of murder. The revelation of Uncle Mortimer's posthumous blackmail operation transformed the household atmosphere from one of supernatural dread to something considerably more earthly and infinitely more dangerous. Mrs. Ashworth received the intelligence with that particular composure that comes from having one's worst suspicions confirmed, while Timothy displayed the restless energy of a young man whose carefully constructed explanations were beginning to crumble under methodical scrutiny. "The night Uncle Mortimer died," Wimsey began, settling into his investigation with the precision of a surgeon examining a wound, "requires our most careful attention. Mrs. Pemberton, your household book, if you please." The housekeeper produced her formidable volume of domestic records with the pride of one whose authority depends upon maintaining exact schedules. "Dinner at 8, my lord. Coffee in the library at 9:15. Family retired between 10 and 10:30. I completed final rounds at 10:40, and the doctor was summoned at 12:42. Summoned by whom? Wimsey inquired with that deceptive casualness that had been known to unnerve hardened criminals. "The call came through from the study telephone, my lord." though I must say, young Master Timothy was in no condition to make such arrangements, quite overcome by the shock of finding his great-uncle in such circumstances. Pritchard, summoned to corroborate the evening's sequence, provided his testimony with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to accuracy. "I secured all doors and windows at 10:30 precisely, my lord. The study telephone sits upon the table nearest the French windows. The line is often temperamental in damp weather. I retired at 10:40 and was awakened by Miss Evelyn at 12:30. She had heard a fall from the attic above." "And the attic door?" Wimsey pressed. "Unlatched, my lord, which was most irregular. Mr. Mortimer invariably bolted himself in during his evening work." Evelyn's account, delivered with the nervous precision of one whose every word might prove incriminating, introduced the crucial discrepancy that transformed suspicious circumstances into probable murder. "I did not telephone the doctor, Lord Peter. I tried, but the line was dead. It often fails when the river mist rises. I ran to wake Mother, and she sent Pritchard to the village by the south hedge." Bunter materialized with his customary efficiency, producing a neatly folded telegram from his coat pocket. "The telephone exchange records, my lord, courtesy of Miss Webb. A call was indeed placed to Dr. Halliday at 12:42, but not from Greyminster 3. From Greyminster 7, the vicarage line. Miss Webb particularly remembers the call because she heard a clock striking distinctly, followed by what she described as a queer additional jangling, as if someone were winding a mechanism directly into the mouthpiece." "The vicarage," murmured Wimsey, his pale eyes brightening with intellectual satisfaction. "A 10-minute walk by the lane, considerably less through the U-belt. One could therefore depart the hall at 12:27, place the call at 12:42, and return to be discovered in pious attendance by 1 o'clock. Rather a neat alibi, if one favors that sort of theatrical precision." To verify his theory, Wimsey conducted what he termed a practical examination of distances, with Bunter keeping precise time. The U-path to the vicarage required 7 minutes in one direction, 6.5 returning, the difference attributable to gradient and the persuasive influence of gravity. Miss Webb, when pressed for additional details, recalled that the caller possessed a town sort of voice, not the vicar's, and that the mysterious jangling sound occurred immediately after the connection was terminated. The investigation of Uncle Mortimer's private effects revealed the true sophistication of his blackmail operation. His desk drawers yielded a velvet-lined tray containing numbered silver bells, each corresponding to detailed records of borrowers, amounts, and the particular secrets that served as collateral. Most significantly, the cavity marked number 17 stood conspicuously empty. Uncle Mortimer's ritual, Timothy explained with obvious reluctance, required the physical return of each bell when a debt was settled. The token represented the continuing obligation. Without it, the borrower was considered free of any further claim. Yet if Miss Evelyn's entry reads, "settled, no further letters," Wimsey observed, one would naturally expect to find bell number 17 restored to its proper place. We do not. This suggests either that the debt remained unresolved, or that someone found the token useful for purposes extending beyond Uncle Mortimer's original intentions. The afternoon's investigations yielded additional evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. Bunter's inquiries in the village revealed that the local ironmonger had sold a small auger to a gentleman from London way the week before Mortimer's death. The chemist identified the mysterious smear on the silver salver as beeswax infused with lampblack, an excellent substance for creating signaling shutters when applied to polished metal or glass. As evening approached, Wimsey positioned himself to observe the next performance of the attic clock's mysterious communication system. At 17 minutes past 8, the familiar sequence began, but this time with significant variations. Instead of the established 7-3-7 pattern, the strike spelled out 7-2-1, each group separated by pauses of meticulous exactness. Through the dormer window, an answering glint flickered from the U-belt. "Rendezvous numbers and instructions," Wimsey murmured to Bunter. "Our horological virtuoso is preparing for a meeting. I believe the evening's entertainment is about to commence." The confrontation, when it came, possessed that quality of theatrical inevitability that characterizes moments when elaborate deceptions finally collapse under accumulated evidence. The figure that emerged from the U-belt moved with practiced stealth, carrying what appeared to be a small silver object that glinted in the moonlight. But as Wimsey stepped into the path with quiet authority, the careful choreography of clandestine communication gave way to the more prosaic reality of criminal exposure. "Mr. Fane," said Wimsey conversationally as the silver bell dropped into his palm like an exhausted bird, "you are remarkably literal in your adherence to Uncle Mortimer's symbolic system." Fane's recovery was swift but incomplete, the sort of resilience that speaks of considerable experience in difficult situations combined with the growing realization that this particular difficulty might prove insurmountable. "You are quicker than your reputation suggests, Lord Peter. Shall we call this an unfortunate misunderstanding?" "By all means," replied Wimsey with that particular smile that had been known to make hardened criminals confess to forgotten crimes. "We shall clarify it at our leisure. You will explain, for instance, why a gentleman dismissed by Professor Whitworth for questionable experiments found it necessary to reconstruct Uncle Mortimer's communication system with inferior tools, why you employed Miss Ashworth's youth to retrieve documents you could not reach yourself, and why you found it convenient to summon medical assistance from the vicarage at a time that suited your particular requirements." In the morning room, with the Ashworth family assembled in that peculiar silence that precedes either revelation or violence, Wimsey placed the recovered bell upon the table with the delicacy of one handling evidence of considerable significance. "An awkward trinket," he observed. "One never knows quite where to put it. Keep it, and one is condemned by possession. Return it, and one remains at the mercy of the recipient's memory." The game, as Lord Peter was fond of observing, had reached that crucial juncture where mechanical precision meets human desperation, and the ancient secrets that Uncle Mortimer had so carefully catalogued and preserved were about to emerge with the inexorable accuracy of a striking clock announcing the hour of judgment for all who had participated in transforming a gentleman's eccentric hobby into an instrument of systematic extortion and, quite possibly, murder. For when a clock strikes 17 at precisely calculated intervals, and when silver bells serve as tokens in elaborate games of human weakness, the machinery of justice begins to operate with the same methodical precision that had once served Uncle Mortimer's peculiar blend of scientific curiosity and financial opportunism. The silver bell's recovery had shifted the investigation from supernatural speculation to methodical criminal detection, but Wimsey recognized that evidence, however compelling, required the sort of dramatic presentation that transforms suspicion into certainty. The morning brought additional revelations in the form of Bunter's systematic examination of the physical evidence, each discovery adding another gear to the clockwork mechanism of justice that was beginning to operate with inexorable precision. "The bell itself," observed Wimsey, examining the recovered token under his magnifying glass, "bears several points of considerable interest. Bunter, if you would demonstrate your findings regarding the numerical inscription." Bunter produced his jeweler's loupe with professional satisfaction. "The number 17 has been struck over an earlier marking, my lord. Under magnification, one can observe the ghostly outline of a 12 beneath the current inscription. The style of the newer numerals differs markedly from Uncle Mortimer's elegant script. Rather more hurried, one might say, and executed with tools slightly missized for the purpose." "A transformation of identity," murmured Wimsey. "Bell number 12 becomes bell number 17 through the simple expedient of creative renumbering. Most illuminating, particularly when one considers that the 17-minute striking sequence serves as our mysterious horologist's primary communication method." The investigation of Uncle Mortimer's private correspondence revealed the true sophistication of his blackmail operation and the specific circumstances that had made his death both necessary and profitable for his successor. Hidden within his desk's secret compartment, Bunter discovered a leather portfolio containing what could only be described as a comprehensive catalogue of local indiscretions, each entry meticulously cross-referenced with its corresponding silver bell. Entry number 12, Wimsey read aloud from Uncle Mortimer's precise script, concerns a certain EEA, with collateral described as letters of romantic nature, potentially compromising to family reputation if revealed. The debt was marked as settled 3 months before Uncle Mortimer's death, with a notation, "Bell returned, obligation cancelled, no further correspondence required." Mrs. Ashworth's sharp intake of breath provided its own commentary on this revelation. "Edgar Ainsworth," she whispered, her voice carrying the particular strain of one whose social calculations have been thoroughly disrupted. "The vicar. He borrowed from Mortimer years ago to cover gambling debts incurred during his university years. We thought the matter was concluded when he repaid the loan. Yet someone found it profitable to resurrect concluded obligations," Wimsey observed, noting Fane's increasingly rigid posture. "The renumbering of bells suggests a systematic reorganization of Uncle Mortimer's filing system with particular attention to cases that might be reactivated under new management." Dr. Halliday's testimony, obtained through Bunter's diplomatic inquiries, provided crucial details about the physical circumstances of Uncle Mortimer's death. The physician's professional observations, initially dismissed as routine, acquired sinister significance when examined in light of the emerging evidence of systematic deception. The position of the body, Dr. Halliday had noted in his private records, suggested a fall backward rather than forward, inconsistent with someone stumbling over workshop debris. The head wound, while certainly fatal, possessed characteristics more typical of a deliberate blow than accidental impact. Most significantly, the hands showed traces of silver polish and lampblack, unusual substances for someone engaged in routine clockwork maintenance. The reconstruction of Uncle Mortimer's final evening began to emerge through careful correlation of witness testimony and physical evidence. The elderly gentleman had indeed been working late on his horological experiments, but his activities had been interrupted by an unexpected visitor whose presence had initially been welcomed rather than feared. Uncle Mortimer's workshop journal, Timothy explained with obvious reluctance, indicates that he had arranged to meet with someone that evening to discuss the transfer of his collection. The entry reads, "CF insists on examining the communication system, claims Whitworth requires detailed documentation for academic purposes, must ensure proper understanding of temporal acoustics before demonstration." "CF," repeated Wimsey thoughtfully. How convenient that academic curiosity should manifest itself at such a precise moment. "Tell me, Mr. Fane, did Professor Whitworth indeed express interest in Uncle Mortimer's temporal acoustics research?" Fane's response carried the particular tension of one whose carefully constructed explanations were beginning to collapse under methodical scrutiny. "Whitworth was always interested in innovative mechanical applications, Lord Peter. Uncle Mortimer's work represented a significant advancement in horological precision." "Indeed," murmured Wimsey, producing from his pocket a telegram that Bunter had discreetly obtained. "How fascinating, then, that Professor Whitworth's secretary confirms he has been conducting research in Zurich for the past 6 months and has had no communication with you regarding Uncle Mortimer's work. Most curious, wouldn't you agree?" The evening's dramatic revelation required the sort of theatrical presentation that transforms accumulated evidence into undeniable truth. Wimsey arranged for the household to gather in the attic workshop, where Uncle Mortimer's bracket clock maintained its silent vigil over the scene of his demise. The autumn light, filtering through the grimy dormer windows, cast long shadows across the workbench where the elderly gentleman had met his end. "Let us reconstruct the events of that fatal evening," Wimsey began, his voice carrying the authority of one whose theories had achieved elegant confirmation. Uncle Mortimer, as was his custom, was working late on his beloved timepieces. He had just completed modifications to the striking mechanism, not for communication purposes, as we initially supposed, but to demonstrate his temporal acoustics research to his expected visitor. He indicated the bracket clock, its brass movement gleaming in the dusty light. The 17-minute interval was indeed Uncle Mortimer's discovery, but its application as a signaling system was entirely Mr. Fane's innovation. The original research concerned acoustic resonance in confined spaces, a legitimate scientific inquiry that was systematically perverted for criminal purposes. Bunter, with the precision of a stage manager, had arranged the workshop to replicate the scene as described in the various testimonies. An oil lamp flickered beside the workbench, casting dancing shadows across the collection of precision instruments and silver bells that had served Uncle Mortimer's peculiar blend of scientific curiosity and financial opportunism. The confrontation began as a scholarly discussion. Wimsey continued, his pale eyes taking on that particular gleam that his acquaintances had learned to associate with imminent revelation. Uncle Mortimer was eager to demonstrate his discoveries to someone he believed possessed genuine academic interest. He explained the mechanical modifications, the acoustic properties, the precise timing required for optimal resonance. The demonstration that followed possessed the chilling precision of a surgeon exposing a wound. Wimsey showed how the horsehair control system allowed for the muting of strikes, how the beeswax shuttering created visual signals, how the entire apparatus could coordinate complex communications across considerable distances. But as Uncle Mortimer explained his system, Wimsey observed, he began to realize that his visitor's interest was not purely academic. The questions became more specific, more focused on practical applications than theoretical principles. Uncle Mortimer, being neither naive nor foolish, began to understand that his life's work was being evaluated for criminal rather than scholarly purposes. The moment of confrontation was reconstructed with methodical precision. Uncle Mortimer's attempt to prevent Fane from appropriating his research had resulted in a struggle that ended when the silver salver, polished to mirror brightness for signaling purposes, was brought down upon the elderly gentleman's skull with fatal force. The lamp, knocked over during the struggle, was hastily righted, but not before its chimney was smoked. Wimsey explained, indicating the telltale traces that Bunter had discovered. The body fell awkwardly, striking the workbench corner to create the secondary wound that would later be interpreted as evidence of accidental death. As the reconstruction reached its climax, the hall clock below struck the quarter hour, followed by the muffled response from the attic timepiece. But now the sound carried an entirely different significance. Not supernatural manifestation, but mechanical testimony to systematic murder and elaborate deception. The 17 chimes that began that very night, Wimsey concluded, announced not Uncle Mortimer's spiritual communication, but Mr. Fane's assumption of control over a blackmail operation that would require murder to achieve its full criminal potential. The confrontation that followed possessed that quality of inevitable collapse that characterizes moments when elaborate deceptions finally succumb to accumulated evidence. Fane's resistance crumbled with the methodical precision of a clock spring unwinding, each revelation emerging with the mechanical inevitability that had characterized Uncle Mortimer's modified timepiece. For when human greed encounters mechanical ingenuity, and when family secrets become instruments of systematic exploitation, the ancient machinery of justice begins to operate with the same methodical accuracy that had once served Uncle Mortimer's peculiar blend of scientific curiosity and financial opportunism, and had ultimately led to his carefully orchestrated murder by someone who understood that dead men tell no tales, but their clocks might continue to strike the hour of judgment for all who had participated in transforming a gentleman's eccentric hobby into an instrument of calculated murder and systematic extortion. The game, as Lord Peter was fond of observing, had reached that crucial juncture where mechanical precision meets human justice, and the 17 chimes that echoed through Greyminster Hall were counting down not to supernatural revelation, but to the moment when carefully concealed truths would finally emerge with the inexorable accuracy of clockwork and the moral authority of justice long delayed but finally, inevitably, served. The Silver Bell's recovery had transformed the investigation from supernatural speculation to methodical criminal prosecution, yet Wimsey recognized that evidence, however compelling, required the sort of careful orchestration that would prevent a desperate man from attempting something considerably more dangerous than mere deception. The morning brought revelations that would have satisfied a less thorough investigator, but Lord Peter had learned through considerable experience that cornered criminals possessed an alarming tendency toward violence when their carefully constructed alibis began to crumble with clockwork precision. "The difficulty with inherited criminal enterprises," observed Wimsey, settling into the morning room with the satisfaction of one whose theories were achieving elegant confirmation, "lies not merely in the transition of management, but in the unexpected resistance one encounters from those who prefer the previous administration. Bunter, I believe Mrs. Pemberton has been conducting a rather sophisticated campaign of domestic sabotage that deserves our admiration." The housekeeper's testimony, when properly elicited, revealed a counter-conspiracy of remarkable ingenuity. Mrs. Pemberton had indeed observed Fane's nocturnal activities, but rather than report them to the authorities, she had undertaken a systematic campaign of interference designed to protect the household from what she correctly identified as a considerably more dangerous threat than Uncle Mortimer's eccentric blackmail operation had ever represented. "The missing oil lamp," she explained with the dignity of one whose professional competence had been questioned by circumstances beyond her control, "was returned to its proper hook during the dinner hour, smoked chimney and all. I would not have the maids suppose blood where there was lampblack, nor would I permit a young gentleman to frighten honest folk with his theatrical nonsense." "Most commendable," murmured Wimsey, noting how this simple act of domestic efficiency had provided crucial evidence of Fane's clandestine activities, and the attic key that wandered so mysteriously between drawer and console. "I placed it where it could be observed, my lord, when I found it missing from my bureau. If someone was borrowing keys without permission, I would have them understand that their activities were not as secret as they supposed." The revelation of Mrs. Pemberton's protective interference explained several puzzling aspects of the case that had seemed to suggest multiple conspirators. Her systematic counter-signaling, moving lamps, relocating keys, adjusting the positions of furniture to indicate unauthorized access, had created a parallel communication system designed to warn the family of danger, while appearing to be merely the sort of domestic vigilance that characterized well-run households. "The pantry salver," she continued with evident satisfaction, "had no business in the attic workshop. I saw the smear upon its surface and took it down for proper cleaning, though I confess I did not immediately recognize the significance of what I had removed." Bunter's subsequent examination of the recovered salver revealed traces that transformed it from domestic implement to murder weapon. The polished silver surface bore microscopic evidence of blood and hair, hastily cleaned but not thoroughly enough to escape scientific scrutiny. More significantly, the pattern of staining indicated that the salver had been used as a striking weapon rather than merely contaminated through proximity to the victim. "The weapon of opportunity," Wimsey explained to the assembled household, "chosen for its availability rather than its suitability. Uncle Mortimer had polished this salver to mirror brightness for his signaling experiments, never suspecting that its reflective properties would ultimately serve to illuminate the circumstances of his own murder." The technical analysis of Fane's deception methods revealed a sophistication that would have impressed Uncle Mortimer himself had the elderly gentleman lived to appreciate the perversion of his life's work. The 17-minute striking interval was not merely a supernatural manifestation, but a carefully calculated communication system that coordinated complex criminal activities across considerable distances. The coded sequences, Wimsey continued, consulting his notes with professional satisfaction, followed a pattern that becomes obvious once one understands the underlying logic. 737 represented a general alert, confirmation that the blackmail operation had been successfully reactivated under new management. 721 indicated specific rendezvous instructions. Eastgate, 2 o'clock. Urgent consultation required. The bell renumbering represented perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Fane's deception. By transforming the Reverend Ainsworth's honorably discharged token into Miss Evelyn's supposedly active obligation, he had created a weapon of emotional manipulation that required no physical threat to achieve complete compliance. Uncle Mortimer's records, Wimsey explained, producing the leather-bound ledger that documented a decade of systematic extortion, show that bell number 12 was returned to the vicar 3 months before the old gentleman's death, with a notation that the debt was settled and no further correspondence would be maintained. Yet Mr. Fane presented this same bell, renumbered as 17, to Miss Evelyn, claiming it represented her own compromising letters and that its retrieval was essential to protecting her family's reputation. The psychological portrait that emerged through careful reconstruction revealed a mind capable of remarkable calculation combined with fatal overconfidence. Fane had indeed possessed the mechanical expertise to modify Uncle Mortimer's timepieces and the academic credentials to gain initial access to the collection, but his understanding of the blackmail operation's human complexities had been fatally incomplete. "Your fundamental error," Wimsey observed, addressing Fane with the detached interest of a naturalist examining a particularly instructive specimen, lay in assuming that extortion is a mechanical process rather than a psychological art. Uncle Mortimer succeeded because he understood his victims' dependencies, their social vulnerabilities, their capacity for both desperation and discretion. You saw only the financial potential without comprehending the delicate human relationships that made the system sustainable. The reconstruction of the murder itself required methodical attention to the sort of details that transform theory into demonstrable fact. Uncle Mortimer's workshop journal revealed that he had indeed arranged to meet with Fane that evening, but his final entries suggested growing suspicion about his visitor's true intentions. The confrontation began as scholarly discussion, Wimsey explained, positioning himself beside the workbench, where the crime had occurred. Uncle Mortimer was eager to demonstrate his temporal acoustics research to someone he believed possessed genuine academic interest. But as he explained his discoveries, he began to realize that his visitor's questions focused more on practical applications than theoretical principles. The struggle that followed was brief but decisive. Uncle Mortimer's attempt to prevent Fane from appropriating his research had resulted in a confrontation that ended when the silver salver, polished for signaling purposes, was brought down upon the elderly gentleman's skull with calculated force. The positioning of the body, the pattern of blood spatter, the overturned lamp with its smoked chimney, all testified to violence hastily concealed rather than accident honestly reported. The 17 chimes that began that very night, Wimsey continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of inevitable justice, announced not Uncle Mortimer's spiritual communication, but your assumption of control over a blackmail operation that would require systematic intimidation to achieve its criminal potential. As the morning progressed, Fane's position became increasingly untenable. Each piece of evidence, each witness testimony, each technical analysis added another gear to the clockwork mechanism of justice that was operating with the same methodical precision that had once served Uncle Mortimer's peculiar blend of scientific curiosity and financial opportunism. The hall clock struck the quarter hour with its usual Protestant rectitude, followed by the muffled response from the attic timepiece. But now the sound carried the weight of testimony rather than mystery, mechanical evidence of the communication system that had been perverted from legitimate research into an instrument of extortion and murder. "The question that remains," observed Wimsey, his pale eyes taking on that particular gleam that his enemies had learned to associate with imminent exposure. "Concerns not the method of your deception, which has been adequately demonstrated, but the precise moment when you realized that Uncle Mortimer's death had become necessary for your plans to succeed." The silence that followed possessed that particular quality of tension that precedes either confession or violence, and Lord Peter prepared himself for whichever eventuality the afternoon might provide. For when elaborate clockwork mechanisms are perverted to serve criminal purposes, and when family secrets become instruments of systematic exploitation, the ancient machinery of justice begins to operate with inexorable accuracy, counting down not to supernatural revelation, but to the moment when carefully concealed truths emerge with the precision of striking clocks, announcing the hour of judgment for all who have participated in transforming scholarly curiosity into calculated murder. The game, as he was fond of observing, had reached that crucial juncture where mechanical precision meets human desperation, and the 17 chimes that continued to echo through Greyminster Hall were announcing not temporal anomalies, but the approaching hour when Crispin Fane would face the earthly consequences of his systematic perversion of Uncle Mortimer's legacy into an instrument of blackmail, intimidation, and ultimately cold-blooded murder. The silence that followed Wimsey's reconstruction possessed that particular quality of tension that precedes either confession or desperate action, and Lord Peter had positioned himself with the careful precision of one who understood that cornered criminals often displayed a regrettable tendency toward violence when their elaborate deceptions began to unravel with clockwork inevitability. The morning light filtering through the grimy dormer windows cast long shadows across Uncle Mortimer's workshop, transforming the space into a stage where the final act of this temporal drama would unfold with methodical precision. "Your reconstruction is admirably thorough, Lord Peter," Fane observed, his voice carrying that particular strain of calculated defiance that suggested a mind still convinced of its own superior intelligence despite the mounting evidence of systematic exposure. "Yet I fear you have constructed an elaborate theory upon rather circumstantial foundations. Mechanical expertise and proximity to unfortunate events do not constitute proof of criminal intent, however artfully they may be arranged." "Indeed," replied Wimsey with the satisfaction of one whose theories were approaching their inevitable confirmation. "Which is why I have taken the liberty of arranging a small demonstration that should clarify any remaining uncertainties. One finds that practical exhibitions often prove more persuasive than theoretical discourse, particularly when dealing with minds of mechanical inclination." He moved to Uncle Mortimer's bracket clock with the reverence of a conductor approaching his orchestra. "Bunter, if you would be so good as to activate the communication system that Mr. Fane has so ingeniously modified for his own purposes." Bunter produced from his coat pocket the brass key recovered from the potting shed, its surface bearing the distinctive scratches of recent filing. With methodical precision, he wound the clock's mechanism, his trained fingers adjusting the modified cam that controlled the striking sequence. The timepiece responded with a series of measured chimes that spelled out the familiar 737 pattern, each strike resonating through the confined space with ceremonial gravity. "The general alert," Wimsey explained, his pale eyes fixed upon Fane with unwavering attention. "Your announcement to accomplices that Uncle Mortimer's blackmail operation had been successfully transferred to new management. But observe what happens when we introduce the external control system you so ingeniously devised." Bunter tugged gently upon the horsehair line that extended from the clock's mechanism through the minute hole in the case. The striking sequence faltered, resumed, then shifted to the 721 pattern that had summoned Confederates from the U-belt during the previous evening's clandestine activities. "External manipulation," murmured Wimsey, "designed to coordinate complex criminal communications across considerable distances. Uncle Mortimer's legitimate research into temporal acoustics perverted into an instrument of systematic extortion and, ultimately, murder." As the demonstration continued, Fane's carefully maintained composure began to show hairline fractures, like fine china subjected to increasing pressure. His hand moved unconsciously toward his waistcoat pocket in the gesture of a man checking a timepiece against a predetermined schedule, then stopped abruptly as he realized the significance of the movement. "Your fundamental miscalculation," Wimsey observed, with the detached interest of a naturalist examining a particularly instructive specimen, "lay in assuming that Uncle Mortimer's operation could be mechanically reproduced without understanding the psychological subtleties that made it sustainable. You saw the financial potential without comprehending the human relationships that provided its foundation." The arrival of Inspector Parker, summoned by Bunter's discreet telegram and accompanied by a constable whose boots had been thoughtfully treated to eliminate their indiscreet squeak, transformed the morning room into an impromptu court of justice where accumulated evidence would be presented with systematic precision. "Lord Peter," Parker said with the quiet satisfaction of one whose professional instincts had been vindicated by methodical investigation, "I trust our timing proves convenient. The technical analysis you requested has yielded some rather illuminating results." He produced a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be a comprehensive forensic examination of the physical evidence. The silver salver bears microscopic traces of blood and hair, hastily cleaned but not thoroughly enough to escape scientific scrutiny. Most significantly, the pattern of staining indicates deliberate use as a striking weapon rather than mere contamination through proximity to the victim. Fane's response was swift but incomplete. The sort of resilience that spoke of considerable experience in difficult situations, combined with the growing realization that this particular difficulty might prove insurmountable. "Gentlemen, surely you cannot seriously propose that a silver serving piece constitutes evidence of premeditated murder. The circumstances of Uncle Mortimer's death were thoroughly investigated by the local authorities and deemed entirely accidental." "Ah, but local authorities," Wimsey replied with that particular smile that had been known to make hardened criminals confess to forgotten crimes, "rarely possess the specialized knowledge required to detect the sort of sophisticated mechanical deceptions that have characterized this case from its inception." He indicated the renumbered silver bell that rested upon the table with malevolent significance. Bell number 12, representing the Reverend Ainsworth's honorably discharged obligation, transformed through creative engraving into bell number 17, the token used to manipulate Miss Evelyn into serving as your unwitting accomplice. A masterpiece of psychological manipulation that required both mechanical skill and intimate knowledge of the family's vulnerabilities. The technical reconstruction that followed would have satisfied the most demanding coroner's jury. Each piece of evidence was presented with theatrical precision: the modified striking mechanism, the external control system, the forged correspondence, the systematic intimidation of household members who possessed inconvenient knowledge of Uncle Mortimer's final evening. "The chronology of that fatal night," Wimsey continued, consulting his notebook with professional thoroughness, "reveals a pattern of calculated deception that transforms suspicious circumstances into probable murder. You arrived at Greyminster Hall ostensibly for scholarly discussion, but your true purpose was to assess the full potential of Uncle Mortimer's blackmail operation and, if necessary, to remove its original proprietor." As the afternoon progressed, the psychological portrait that emerged through careful questioning revealed a mind capable of remarkable calculation, combined with fatal overconfidence. Fane had indeed possessed the mechanical expertise to modify Uncle Mortimer's timepieces and the academic credentials to gain initial access to the collection, but his understanding of the operation's human complexities had been catastrophically incomplete. Uncle Mortimer succeeded, Wimsey explained for Parker's benefit, because he conducted his affairs with gentlemanly restraint rather than crude intimidation. His victims remained loyal because they understood the rules of engagement and trusted in his discretion. You, Mr. Fane, attempted to transform a sophisticated psychological manipulation into a mechanical process, and the results were inevitably disastrous. The hall clock struck the quarter hour with its usual Protestant rectitude, followed by the muffled response from the attic timepiece. But now the sound carried a different significance entirely, not supernatural manifestation, but mechanical testimony to systematic murder and elaborate deception. Fane flinched with each chime, his body tensing as if physically assaulted by the sound that had once served his criminal purposes. 17 strikes, observed Wimsey as the final chime faded into silence. No longer mysterious temporal manifestations, but the mechanical heartbeat of a criminal enterprise that required murder to achieve its full potential. Each chime an accusation, each interval a reminder of the violence that made your elaborate deception possible. The confession, when it finally came, possessed that quality of inevitable collapse that characterizes moments when elaborate deceptions succumb to accumulated pressure. Fane's resistance crumbled with the methodical precision of a clock spring unwinding, each admission emerging with the mechanical inevitability that had characterized Uncle Mortimer's modified timepiece. The old gentleman was more perceptive than I anticipated, Fane admitted, his voice carrying the particular strain of one whose carefully constructed explanations had been thoroughly demolished. He realized that my interest extended beyond pure scholarship, that I understood the financial potential of his communication system far better than he supposed. When he attempted to prevent me from examining his records, the confrontation became regrettably necessary. "And the systematic intimidation of Miss Ashworth?" Parker inquired with professional thoroughness. "A demonstration of the operation's continuing viability under new management," Fane replied with the detached tone of one discussing mechanical efficiency rather than human suffering. The family needed to understand that Uncle Mortimer's death had not terminated their obligations, merely transferred them to more energetic supervision. Inspector Parker's arrest of Crispin Fane proceeded with the methodical efficiency that characterizes well-executed police work, though the prisoner's final statement possessed that quality of bitter irony that often accompanies the exposure of elaborate criminal schemes. "You have been most thorough, Lord Peter," Fane observed as the handcuffs clicked into place with mechanical precision. "Though I confess I had not anticipated that Uncle Mortimer's domestic staff would prove more formidable opponents than his mechanical ingenuity." As the police departed with their prisoner, Wimsey remained in the attic workshop, his hand resting lightly upon Uncle Mortimer's bracket clock. The ancient timepiece had resumed its normal function, striking the hours with Protestant rectitude rather than criminal communication, its mechanical rebellion finally subdued by the restoration of proper authority. "You have done your duty," he said to the clock with half-idle gravity. "You have told your tale, roundabout as always with inanimate witnesses. Tomorrow we shall beg you to return to conventional timekeeping, though I suspect you will always remember the 17 minutes that transformed temporal research into an instrument of murder." The game, as Lord Peter was fond of observing, had reached that satisfactory conclusion where human justice operates with the same methodical accuracy that had once served Uncle Mortimer's peculiar blend of scientific curiosity and financial opportunism. The 17 chimes that had echoed through Greyminster Hall with such mysterious persistence would soon fall silent, their communication system dismantled and their creator's murderer removed to face the earthly consequences of his systematic perversion of scholarly research into calculated homicide. For when clockwork mechanisms are perverted to serve criminal purposes, and when family secrets become instruments of systematic exploitation, the ancient machinery of justice begins to operate with inexorable precision, counting down not to supernatural revelation, but to the moment when carefully concealed truths emerge, with the accuracy of striking clocks announcing the hour of judgment for all who have participated in transforming a gentleman's eccentric hobby into an instrument of blackmail, intimidation, and ultimately cold-blooded murder. The house settled into its customary quiet, no longer disturbed by mysterious chimes or supernatural manifestations, but restored to the sort of domestic tranquility that comes from having inconvenient truths properly exposed and dangerous criminals safely removed from polite society. Uncle Mortimer's legacy would survive, but as legitimate horological research rather than the foundation for systematic extortion, a transformation that would have pleased the eccentric gentleman whose love of temporal precision had been so thoroughly perverted by those who understood mechanics, but not morality. The hours following Crispin Fane's arrest proceeded with that particular blend of administrative necessity and domestic rehabilitation that characterizes households where elaborate deceptions have been methodically exposed and their perpetrators removed to face earthly justice. Inspector Parker, with the quiet efficiency of one who prefers documented facts to theatrical revelations, established himself in the morning room to collect the sort of precise testimonies that would transform criminal conspiracy into legal prosecution. Mrs. Pemberton, summoned to provide her account of the domestic irregularities, delivered her statement with the dignified satisfaction of one whose professional instincts had been vindicated by recent events. "The young gentleman's interest in our household routines was most particular, my lord," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of one who had successfully conducted counter-surveillance operations without compromising her duties as housekeeper. "Honest scholars don't require detailed information about servants' schedules or the precise location of spare keys." Pritchard corroborated her observations with the methodical precision that had made him invaluable during the investigation. His testimony regarding door locks, telephone failures, and the mysterious appearance of keys on hall consoles provided the sort of circumstantial evidence that transforms suspicion into certainty when properly assembled by competent authority. The Reverend's confession and restoration. The arrival of the Reverend Ainsworth shortly after Parker's departure brought resolution to one of the case's more delicate complications. The clergyman appeared with that particular combination of pastoral dignity and personal embarrassment that characterizes men of the cloth who have been systematically deceived by criminal intelligence masquerading as academic respectability. "I was utterly taken in," he confessed, his voice carrying the strain of one whose trust had been professionally exploited. "Mr. Fane called upon me months ago, representing himself as Professor Whitworth's agent, requesting the loan of my bell for academic cataloguing purposes. He spoke so knowledgeably of Uncle Mortimer's research, so respectfully of the need to preserve scholarly legacy, that I never suspected his true intentions." Wimsey received this confession with the gentle understanding he reserved for those whose virtue had made them vulnerable to sophisticated deception. "Your candor does you credit, Reverend," he observed, producing the properly restored silver bell from his waistcoat pocket. "Bell number 12, returned to its rightful owner with its original inscription restored and its honor intact. Bunter has taken the liberty of polishing it to proper ecclesiastical standards." The disposition of secrets. The question of Uncle Mortimer's accumulated papers required delicate consideration of both legal necessity and human compassion. Mrs. Ashworth approached this matter with the practical wisdom of one who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve, regardless of its historical significance. "The records contained secrets that could destroy innocent people," she observed, her hands clasped with the tension of one making difficult moral calculations. Uncle Mortimer may have been a gentleman blackmailer, but the pain these revelations could cause would outlast any academic interest they might possess. Wimsey's counsel reflected his considerable experience with the aftermath of criminal exposure. "There are two schools of thought regarding such archives," he explained with characteristic precision. "One advocates preservation for historical completeness. The other recommends judicious destruction for human mercy. In this case, I believe Uncle Mortimer himself would choose compassion over curiosity." The ceremonial burning of the compromising documents proceeded with solemn dignity in the library fireplace. Mrs. Pemberton presided over this domestic auto-da-fe with the satisfaction of one who had long wished to apply flame to other people's accumulated indiscretions. The papers that fed the fire represented decades of human weakness, carefully catalogued and systematically exploited, their destruction marking the end of Uncle Mortimer's peculiar financial arrangements in the beginning of genuine peace for those whose secrets had been held in mechanical bondage. Technical restoration and mechanical redemption. The restoration of Uncle Mortimer's workshop to its original purpose required Bunter's most delicate touch. With surgical precision, he dismantled every trace of Fane's criminal modifications while preserving the legitimate horological research that had been so thoroughly perverted for systematic extortion. The external control mechanism has been completely removed, Bunter reported with professional satisfaction, along with the crude cam that interfered with the striking train's normal operation. The horsehair signaling system and beeswax shuttering apparatus have been eliminated, restoring the clock to its proper function as a precision timepiece rather than a communication device for criminal coordination. Timothy, observing this mechanical rehabilitation with the fascination of one whose academic interests had been systematically exploited, asked whether Uncle Mortimer's legitimate research could be preserved for scholarly examination. His temporal acoustics discoveries were genuine scientific contributions, he observed, with touching loyalty to his great-uncle's memory. It would be tragic if Fane's criminal perversion destroyed their legitimate value. Science, Wimsey replied with quiet authority, survives the corruption of individual scientists. Uncle Mortimer's research will be properly documented and submitted to Professor Whitworth for peer review, freed from criminal contamination and available for honest scholarly examination. Knowledge, properly applied, serves humanity. Improperly applied, it serves only the criminal imagination that perverts it. Psychological recovery and domestic rehabilitation. As evening settled upon Greyminster Hall, the household began to display those subtle signs of psychological recovery that follow the successful resolution of systematic deception. Mrs. Ashworth moved with renewed confidence, no longer burdened by the fear that family secrets might be weaponized against domestic tranquility. Evelyn showed the particular relief of one whose youthful indiscretions had been protected rather than exploited, while Timothy grappled with the uncomfortable realization that academic brilliance required moral guidance to achieve beneficial rather than destructive ends. The difficulty, Wimsey observed during their final dinner together, lies not in detecting criminal intelligence, but in understanding how legitimate expertise becomes corrupted by moral deficiency. Mr. Fane possessed genuine mechanical knowledge and authentic scholarly credentials. It was his application of these gifts that proved so thoroughly objectionable. Philosophical reflections and final departure. The following morning brought Wimsey's departure with that mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that characterizes the conclusion of complex investigations. As Bunter loaded their modest luggage into the motor car, Lord Peter took his final survey of the ancient house that had harbored such elaborate deceptions beneath its veneer of rural respectability. Uncle Mortimer's legacy survives, he observed to Mrs. Ashworth, who had accompanied him to the entrance hall where the restored bracket clock maintained its honest vigil. His genuine contributions to horological science will be preserved and properly credited, while his less admirable financial arrangements have been consigned to the flames they deserved. The clock will strike only honest hours, and the bells will summon only to legitimate purposes. The ancient timepiece, as if responding to this benediction, struck the quarter hour with mechanical precision, no longer augmented by rebellious chimes or mysterious communications, but restored to the simple dignity of marking temporal passage according to divine rather than criminal intention. As their motor car departed through the U-belt that had concealed so many clandestine activities, Wimsey reflected upon the peculiar satisfaction that comes from exposing elaborate criminal schemes through patient attention to mechanical detail and psychological insight. The 17 chimes that had echoed through Greyminster Hall with such mysterious persistence had been silenced forever, their communication system dismantled, and their criminal purpose exposed to the methodical scrutiny of justice. The supernatural, he observed to Bunter as the Gloucestershire countryside rolled past their windows, invariably proves to be a rather poor alibi for human wickedness. When clocks strike irregular hours, one should suspect mechanical interference rather than ghostly intervention. And when mechanical interference serves criminal purposes, one may be certain that human greed has discovered new methods for exploiting the ancient weaknesses of conscience and the perpetual vulnerability of secrets to systematic exploitation. The case was closed, the mystery resolved, and the only sound that followed their departure was the honest ticking of properly regulated timepieces marking the passage of hours according to natural law rather than criminal design. Uncle Mortimer's attic had been restored to scholarly purpose, his family had been preserved from scandal, and his murderer had been removed to face the earthly consequences of transforming horological genius into an instrument of blackmail, intimidation, and calculated murder. For when clockwork mechanisms are restored to their proper function, and when family secrets are protected by legitimate discretion rather than criminal extortion, the ancient machinery of domestic tranquility begins to operate with the reliable precision that had once served Uncle Mortimer's genuine love of temporal accuracy. Before that innocent enthusiasm was perverted by those who understood mechanical ingenuity but possessed no comprehension of moral restraint or human decency. The game, as Lord Peter was fond of observing, had reached that satisfactory conclusion where human justice operates with the same methodical accuracy that characterizes precision timepieces when properly maintained and honestly employed. A resolution that would have pleased Uncle Mortimer himself had he lived to witness the restoration of his life's work to its intended purpose of advancing human knowledge rather than exploiting human weakness. Epilogue and witty exit. It was a fortnight later, on one of those crystalline November mornings that make London look like an architectural drawing and feel like a moral proposition, when Parker arrived at Piccadilly for breakfast and set down his coffee cup with the deliberate precision of a man who prefers facts to remain as orderly as his crockery. "Fane is committed for trial," he announced with quiet satisfaction. "Murder in the first degree. He attempted the scholarly accident defense. Counsel suggested a melancholy misadventure amid delicate apparatus." The salver evidence undid him completely, of course. That and the vicarage telephone call. Miss Webb's testimony about the clock striking during the conversation was particularly damaging. "Ah, the perils of theatrical precision," observed Wimsey, delicately buttering his toast. "One finds that criminals with mechanical inclinations invariably over-engineer their alibis. Do have some of these excellent kippers, Charles. They are not unlike Uncle Mortimer's bells, numbered according to any mysterious system, but they respond admirably when summoned." Parker smiled and complied. The ironmonger identified him without hesitation, remembered the London accent and the impatient tapping of coins while purchasing that auger. "We found the tradesman's receipt in his lodgings." Professor Whitworth's response from Zurich was illuminating. He wrote that Fane ceased to be my pupil in scholarship years ago, and apparently never was my pupil in honor. "Concise, classical, and devastating," murmured Wimsey approvingly. "One might call it Attic in its restraint, appropriately enough, considering our recent adventures in that particular architectural feature." "Greyminster has returned to blessed normalcy," Parker continued. "No more mysterious 17 chimes. Mrs. Pemberton has re-established her domestic reign with renewed authority. Pritchard has discovered that doors may be locked without symbolism, and the Reverend Ainsworth delivered what I'm told was a rather moving sermon on the theme of sounding brass and tinkling cymbals. One symbol, Charles, singular in the authorized version. A plurality suggests pagan orchestration, which would hardly suit our good vicar's theological position. "Trust you to rescue monotheism through grammatical precision," Parker replied with familiar affection. "Timothy Ashworth returns to Cambridge under proper supervision next term. Miss Evelyn has begun correspondence with Somerville College about cataloguing Uncle Mortimer's legitimate research for scholarly publication. And Mrs. Ashworth has declared the subject of irregular time-keeping taboo until after Christmas. Most sensible, Even temporal mechanics deserve seasonal respite. There remained, as there always does in properly resolved cases, one small mechanical detail that accounted for the entire affair's particular resonance. Parker, who had learned to wait for these explanatory codas, continued his breakfast with ostentatious patience until Wimsey took pity on his curiosity. "You are wondering about the 17-minute interval," Wimsey observed, adjusting his monocle. "Not mysticism, Charles, nor lunar calculation, nor any cabalistic preference beloved of eccentric gentlemen with private mythologies. Uncle Mortimer began with practical acoustic observation. If one wishes a sound to be distinctly noticeable in a household accustomed to conventional quarter and half-hour strikes, one must select an interval that never coincides with normal temporal announcements." He paused to sip his coffee with the satisfaction of one explaining elegant simplicity. "Make it a prime number, and you reduce coincidental interference. Make it 17, and you avoid the servants' scheduled activities. At Greyminster, the staff draws water at predictable intervals, producing what Timothy rather poetically termed hydrophonic hymns at the conventional quarters. Further, 17 minutes past each hour falls conveniently after household settling, but before village telephone exchanges become active. Uncle Mortimer's temporal acoustics were, at their foundation, common sense dignified with classical terminology. And Fane merely appropriated the system for criminal communication? Precisely. He added the horsehair control and beeswax signaling apparatus, then called it mechanical innovation. Criminal cleverness resembles the verb to be, grammatically essential, practically useful, capable of connecting any subject to any predicate. But the moral content depends entirely upon what one chooses to link together. Uncle Mortimer's predicate was scientific curiosity. Fane's was systematic compulsion. That afternoon found them motoring through the Gloucestershire countryside, where autumn had painted the landscape with the sort of moral clarity that follows the successful resolution of human complications. Greyminster Hall received them with that particular atmosphere of domestic tranquility that characterizes households where dangerous secrets have been properly exposed and their guardians removed to face appropriate justice. Mrs. Ashworth greeted them in the entrance hall, where Uncle Mortimer's bracket clock maintained its restored vigil with Protestant rectitude, striking 12 chimes for 12 o'clock. No rebellious additions, no mysterious communications, only the honest declaration of temporal passage, according to divine ordinance rather than criminal manipulation. "The house feels entirely different," she observed with touching gratitude, "as if some oppressive weight has been lifted. Uncle Mortimer's legitimate research will be preserved and published through proper academic channels, while his less admirable enterprises have been consigned to the flames they deserved." Timothy appeared with renewed confidence, carrying a leather portfolio containing his great-uncle's restored workshop notes. "Professor Whitworth has agreed to supervise the preparation of Uncle Mortimer's temporal acoustics research and for presentation to the Royal Society," he announced with shy pride. "The legitimate discoveries will survive to benefit scholarship, separated from their unfortunate criminal applications. Knowledge redeemed through proper moral application," Wimsey observed approvingly. "Your great-uncle's genuine contributions to horological science will serve their intended purpose of advancing human understanding rather than exploiting human weakness." Mrs. Pemberton, summoned to receive their thanks, confined herself to the observation that honest work and honest timekeeping both require regular maintenance, my lord, but they reward the effort with reliable service. It was, though not classical in expression, a domestic aphorism of considerable practical wisdom. As they prepared for departure, Evelyn appeared with that particular glow of relief that comes from having youthful indiscretions protected rather than exploited. "I've begun correspondence with Miss Lawrence at Somerville about cataloguing Uncle Mortimer's papers," she said quietly. "It seems fitting that his legitimate legacy should be preserved by proper scholarly methods." "Most appropriate," Wimsey replied warmly. Academic collaboration represents the antithesis of criminal conspiracy, knowledge shared for human benefit rather than hoarded for personal advantage. The ancient bracket clock struck the quarter hour as they stood in final farewell, its chimes carrying none of the mysterious resonance that had characterized recent performances. The sound possessed only the honest dignity of mechanical duty properly fulfilled, marking temporal passage with the reliability that comes from restoration to intended purpose. If you must preserve any relic of this affair, Wimsey advised Mrs. Ashworth, let it be the lesson rather than the apparatus. Uncle Mortimer's legitimate discoveries deserve scholarly recognition. His blackmail operation merited only the flames that consumed it. The distinction between knowledge and its application, between mechanical genius and moral wisdom, should serve as his true monument. Outside, the ewes whispered in the small wind that makes itself heard only when human engines fall silent. The gravel crunched beneath their tires with that particularly moral sound that gravel produces when one departs, having accomplished what one came to do. Turkish tobacco, Bunter observed as they reached the main road, proves inferior as criminal camouflage because of its distinctive persistence. Affectation, among vices, possesses the least hygienic qualities. Quite so, Wimsey agreed. Parker will require a summary for his official report. Tell him it was murder by precaution masquerading as accident by temperament. Give him the vicarage telephone call, the ironmonger's auger, the renumbered bell, and the salver evidence. Let him reserve the 17-minute explanation for his private notebook. Juries believe in silver bells and blunt instruments. They require more sophisticated explanation to appreciate the criminal applications of temporal mechanics. That evening, ensconced in his Piccadilly flat, where the fire burned with honest warmth and his modest French mantel clock ticked the common life back into spaces that investigation had temporarily hollowed, Wimsey reflected upon the peculiar satisfaction that comes from restoring both mechanical and moral precision to their proper functions. One becomes too fond of mechanisms, he observed to Bunter, who was producing a claret with admirable timing. They possess such consoling obedience, input pride, output theft, input fear, output extortion, input loneliness, output systematic rules for human exploitation. Uncle Mortimer made his bells represent trust. Fane transformed them into instruments of intimidation. Always the same machinery, only the operator's moral calibration determines the result. Bunter, polishing crystal to the point of invisibility, permitted himself the mildest philosophical observation. There remains, nevertheless, considerable satisfaction in witnessing clockwork restored to honest function, my lord. Indeed, Wimsey replied, raising his glass in salute, to restored timepieces and properly buried secrets. The world operates more smoothly when mechanical precision serves moral rather than criminal purposes. Somewhere in the street below, London pursued its ancient rhythms, handsome hooves clicking against cobblestones, newspaper vendors announcing tomorrow's concerns, the distant chiming of church bells marking evening prayers. The French clock struck 10 with modest precision, having fulfilled its temporal obligations without theatrical embellishment or criminal communication. Tempus edax rerum, Wimsey quoted to the dancing flames. Then, because he had never conceded final victory to time's appetite, he added with characteristic insouciance, though tonight at least the consumption has been entirely on the side of justice. The clock in the attic had told its tale with mechanical honesty, revealing not supernatural manifestation but human calculation, not ghostly communication, but criminal coordination. The 17 chimes had fallen silent, their message delivered and their criminal purpose exposed. Time would continue its eternal passage, marked now by honest clockwork rather than systematic deception, in a house where family secrets enjoyed legitimate protection and the ancient machinery of domestic peace operated with the reliable precision that comes from having dangerous truths properly illuminated and their guardians removed to face the earthly consequences of transforming scholarly brilliance into an instrument of blackmail, intimidation, and calculated murder.